Hey guys! Tonight we begin with a question that sounds almost absurd until you realize how many people died because of the answer. Why would a medieval lord deliberately water down his own beer during the coldest months of winter? Why would a man who controlled every barrel, every grain shipment, every brewing kettle in his domain choose to serve his people something weaker precisely when they needed warmth most? The answer isn't charity. The answer isn't economics. The answer is that winter turns halls into pressure cookers, and strong beer turns men into grenades.
Picture a medieval great hall in January. Not the romantic version from movies with roaring fires and jolly feasting. The real version. 50 to 100 people crammed into a stone box because everywhere else means freezing. These aren't strangers politely sharing a train car. These are families who've been watching each other's faces for 3 months straight. Rivals who competed for the same woman last summer. Brothers who still haven't settled who gets the north field when father dies. Men who remember exactly which household ate better during the last famine. And all of them are trapped together, getting drunk every single night because ale is the only safe thing to drink, and there's nothing else to do after dark.
The math is horrifying. A medieval household member might drink a gallon of ale daily. Multiply that by 100 people across a winter that lasts 4 months, and you're looking at 12,000 gallons of accumulated alcohol flowing through a population that can't get away from each other. Strong beer doesn't just warm the belly, it loosens the tongue, it sharpens old grievances, it convinces men that tonight is finally the night to say what's been building since harvest. Before we continue, let me ask you something. If you're the type who finds yourself watching videos about medieval drinking customs and household violence prevention at 2 in the morning, you're exactly who I make these for. Consider subscribing if that sounds like you, and tell me in the comments what time it is where you are right now. I'm genuinely curious what hours we all keep, scattered across time zones, learning about the bizarre ways our ancestors tried not to kill each other.
If you're settling in for this, grab something warm. Turn the lights low. We're going to spend the next while exploring one of history's strangest peace treaties, the one signed between lords and the brewing kettle.
The system that emerged wasn't written in any law book. It developed organically across centuries because the alternative was bodies. Lords and stewards across medieval Europe independently discovered the same terrible truth around the 11th and 12th centuries. The strength of your winter beer directly correlates with your spring burial count. Weaker ale meant fewer funerals. It meant fewer blood feuds sparked by drunken insults. It meant fewer revenge killings that echoed through generations. The quiet rules developed not from wisdom, but from counting corpses.
Consider the Hall of Ethelred of Wessex in 1043. The chronicler William of Malmesbury records what happened when the standard brewing practice continued through an unusually harsh February. The household had been confined for 6 weeks. Tempers frayed. Grievances festered. The ale remained at its normal autumn strength because nobody thought to adjust for circumstance. On the night of the Feast of Candlemas, a disagreement over a serving of meat escalated into a brawl that left 3 men dead and 7 wounded. 2 of the dead were brothers who'd fought over the same slight their grandfather remembered from 40 years prior. The third was a steward who tried to intervene. The ale hadn't created the hatred, but the ale had dissolved the thin membrane of self-control that kept hatred contained.
Ethelred's response became one of the first documented examples of deliberate winter brewing modifications. The following year, his orders to the brewing house specified that ale produced between the feasts of All Saints and Easter should contain substantially less malt per batch. The resulting beer would be thinner, weaker, less satisfying. His household complained, naturally. Thin winter ale became a source of mockery and resentment, but nobody died. The mathematics shifted in favor of survival.
The practice spread through observation and necessity. A visiting lord notices that his host's household seems unusually calm during the confined months. He inquires, he learns, he brings the knowledge home. Within 2 generations, the concept of seasonal beer strength becomes an unspoken standard across most of Northern Europe. The Germans call it Schmalzbier, thin beer. The English call it small ale. The Norse have a term that roughly translates to hall peace drink. Different names, same desperate solution to the same desperate problem.
But the story is more complicated than simple dilution. Weak beer creates its own problems. People drink more of it to achieve the same effect. The body still craves the warmth and caloric density that strong ale provides during cold months. A gallon of small ale provides less nutrition than a quart of strong beer, which means hunger compounds the psychological strain of confinement. Lords who weakened their beer too much found themselves facing a different kind of unrest, the slow simmer of constant dissatisfaction, rather than the explosive violence of drunkenness.
The optimization process took centuries. Different households experimented with different ratios. Some maintained strong beer, but restricted quantities through the appointment of ale wardens who controlled access to the barrels. Others alternated weekdays and strong days, creating a rhythm that prevented both chronic inebriation and chronic resentment. The monastery of Cluny developed an elaborate system where the strength of the daily beer corresponded to the liturgical calendar, stronger on feast days, weaker during ordinary time, weakest during Lent, when tempers were already shortened by fasting.
The system that eventually became standard across most of medieval Europe involved maintaining 2 or 3 grades of beer simultaneously. The strongest, called in various languages double ale or lord's beer or abbey strength, remained available to the household head and distinguished guests. The middle grade supplied daily drinking for the upper servants and skilled workers. The weakest, the small beer, went to everyone else and became the default during the dangerous winter months when communal confinement tested human nature to its limits.
This stratification created its own social tensions. Access to strong beer became a marker of status, as meaningful as clothing or seating position at table. The steward who could grant or deny access to the better barrels wielded genuine power. Complaints about being served thin ale appear constantly in medieval literature, often played for comedy, but carrying an undertone of genuine class resentment. And a lord wanted to insult a visitor without open confrontation. Serving them small beer communicated contempt as clearly as any words.
The English noble household of the 13th century maintained elaborate records of beer distribution that revealed the complexity of the system. The Earl of Leicester's household accounts from 1265 show that during the winter months, the daily beer ration for common servants dropped to approximately 2/3 its summer strength. But the accounts also show that this reduction was offset by a slight increase in the bread ration and the addition of a daily portion of dried peas. The Lord understood that weakening the alcohol required strengthening something else, or the simmering resentment would find other outlets. The quiet rules extended beyond simple alcohol strength. Medieval household management during winter months developed an entire vocabulary of de-escalation that modern corporate managers would recognize immediately. Seating arrangements in the hall became subject to constant rotation to prevent the same personalities from abrading against each other night after night. Entertainment was scheduled not for enjoyment, but for distraction. Traveling musicians and storytellers paid premium rates during winter precisely because their value lay not in artistry, but in absorbing attention that might otherwise focus on grievances.
The role of the household steward during winter evolved into something resembling a psychological warfare specialist. The good steward anticipated conflicts before they erupted. He noticed when two men were developing a grudge and arranged for them to work on opposite ends of whatever task needed doing. He tracked the menstrual cycles of the women in the household because experience taught that certain combinations of personalities became volatile at predictable intervals. He maintained a mental map of every simmering resentment and spent his days arranging circumstances to prevent detonation.
The physical architecture of medieval halls reflected this psychological reality. The great halls that survive from this period often feature design elements that seem puzzling until you understand their purpose. Multiple entrances allowed people to leave without pushing past others. Screens and partitions created sightlines that could be blocked, preventing the locked-eye stare-down that precedes violence. The raised dais where the lord sat provided not just status but surveillance, a clear view across the entire hall to spot trouble before it escalated. Even the timing of meals served purposes beyond nutrition. The standard pattern of eating twice daily, the main dinner at midday and a lighter supper before dark, created natural breaks in the drinking schedule. The afternoon hours between meals provided a window when alcohol levels dropped and clear-headed work could be accomplished. By the time supper arrived and drinking resumed, the day's accumulated tensions had been partially processed through physical labor. The rules about weapons provide perhaps the clearest evidence of how seriously medieval households took the threat of winter violence. The standard practice required all personal weapons to be surrendered upon entering a hall and stored in a designated location under guard. This wasn't just about preventing assassination of the lord. It was about preventing the spontaneous violence that erupts when drunk men with knives disagree about anything at all. The weapon storage room became one of the most important spaces in any household, and the keeper of weapons held a position of enormous trust. But you can't remove all weapons from a medieval household. The kitchen requires knives. The workshop requires tools. The stable requires implements. The solution involved a complex system of controlled access, where anyone needing a cutting implement for work would receive it from a designated custodian and return it immediately upon completing the task. The accounts of the monastery at Bury St. Edmunds include detailed records of every knife issued and returned during winter months, with the borrower's name, the purpose, and the duration of the loan recorded precisely. Medieval bureaucracy at its most paranoid and probably most necessary. The consequences for violating the quiet rules varied by severity and status. A servant who started a fight might receive a beating and expulsion from the household, exile into winter that could easily prove fatal. A member of the minor gentry caught brawling faced financial penalties and social disgrace. But the most severe consequences fell on those who violated the drinking protocols themselves. The man who smuggled strong drink into an area where weak ale was mandated faced punishment far exceeding anything imposed for simple violence, because his crime wasn't just personal misbehavior. His crime was sabotaging the entire system that kept everyone alive. The Church developed its own parallel system during this period, both supporting and sometimes complicating the secular quiet rules. Monastic communities faced the same winter confinement pressures as noble households, with the additional challenge that monks and nuns had theoretically renounced violence entirely. The monastery solution emphasized routine and exhaustion, the famous Benedictine schedule of prayer 7 times daily, serving partly as spiritual discipline, but also as a mechanism for keeping people too tired and too scheduled to develop serious conflicts. The Cistercian order meant further, requiring that monks maintain silence except during specific hours. This innovation spread rapidly once other orders recognized its value.
People who aren't speaking can't escalate verbal conflicts into physical ones. The silent meals that seem like mere ascetic practice served a profoundly practical purpose. A dining hall full of men who cannot speak is a dining hall where nobody can deliver the insult that triggers bloodshed. Church involvement brought legal force to the quiet rules. Local synods across Europe issued decrees regarding drinking behaviour during winter months, threatening spiritual penalties for those who fomented discord. The parish priest became an enforcer of peace, visiting households to assess tensions and counsel restraint. The confessional became an intelligence-gathering operation, where priests learned which conflicts were developing before they exploded. This information flowed upward through church hierarchy and often back to secular lords, who used it to preemptively separate potential combatants. The Norman conquest of England brought continental practices to a population that had developed its own methods for managing winter violence. The resulting synthesis produced some of the most sophisticated household management systems in medieval Europe. Norman lords imported their tiered beer system and their elaborate steward protocols. Anglo-Saxon households contributed their tradition of communal justice, where the entire community bore responsibility for preventing violence. The fusion created the characteristic English manor system, where everyone watched everyone else and reported concerning behaviour to designated officials.
The Frank Pledge system, where groups of 10 households were mutually responsible for each other's behaviour, applied directly to winter drinking practices. If a man from your group caused violence while drunk, every other household in your Frank Pledge paid a fine. This created intense social pressure to monitor and control alcohol consumption within your community. Your neighbours' drinking habits became your financial liability. The result was a culture of constant surveillance, where strong drink during winter months carried not just personal consequences, but community-wide repercussions. The economics of winter brewing deserve attention because they reveal how deeply embedded these practices became in medieval life. A manor had to plan its grain allocation a year in advance, setting aside specific quantities for strong beer and weak beer, with the understanding that the ratio would shift by season. The brewing schedule itself had to accommodate this variation, with different batches started at different times to ensure appropriate supply when needed. The brewster who managed this complex timeline held a position of considerable responsibility, and her decisions about when to brew what could literally determine who lived and who died.
Markets reflected these patterns. The price of malt rose predictably in autumn as households stocked up for strong autumn brewing before transitioning to weaker winter production. Travelling merchants learned to time their routes to coincide with these seasonal variations, carrying certain goods when disposable grain was available and other goods when households were conserving resources. The entire rhythm of medieval commerce synchronized with the brewing calendar and its implications for winter peace.
Guild regulations added another layer of enforcement. The brewers' guilds of medieval cities adopted rules about seasonal strength that matched what individual households practiced informally. A brewer caught selling strong ale during designated weak ale periods faced expulsion from the guild and prohibition from practicing the trade. The stated justification involved quality control and consumer protection, but the actual purpose was maintaining the peace. Cities with hundreds or thousands of people crowded into narrow streets couldn't afford the chaos that cheap, strong winter ale would produce.
The City of London's brewing regulations from the 13th century specify exactly what strength of ale could be sold during which months. Violators faced not just guild punishment, but civil penalties enforced by the aldermen. The connection between alcohol strength and public order appears explicitly in these documents, with preambles stating that the regulations exist to prevent affrays, reduce violence, and maintain the king's peace. Medieval legislators understood exactly what they were trying to accomplish and weren't shy about saying so.
But not everyone accepted the system quietly. Resistance to the weak winter ale took various forms, from simple grumbling to elaborate schemes for circumvention. Wealthy individuals maintained private supplies of strong drink, claiming medical necessity or religious obligation. Merchants smuggled concentrated spirits from distant regions where different rules applied. Servants stole from their lords' private stocks. The constant effort to enforce weak ale compliance suggests that the desire for strong drink never diminished, only its availability.
The most dramatic resistance came from those who simply refused to accept the constraint. Medieval court records include numerous cases of individuals prosecuted for maintaining private brewing operations that produced strong ale during prohibited periods. The penalties were severe, including confiscation of brewing equipment, substantial fines, and sometimes physical punishment. But the persistence of the offense indicates how strong the craving remained. People risked their livelihoods and their bodies for access to alcohol that their communities had determined they shouldn't have.
The quiet rules produced their own category of conflict. Arguments about whether someone was drinking too strong, whether a particular batch of ale violated the standards, whether an exception applied in a particular case. These disputes filled considerable space in manorial court records. The system designed to prevent violence generated endless litigation about its own implementation. Medieval lawyers grew prosperous arguing the fine points of brewing regulations, while the underlying problem of human nature in confined spaces remained stubbornly unsolved.
The medical understanding of the period contributed its own justifications for seasonal beer strength. Humoral theory held that the body required different foods and drinks, depending on season, to maintain proper balance. Winter cold required foods that were warm and dry in humoral terms, which didn't necessarily correlate with actual alcohol content. Physicians recommended specific brewing recipes for winter that happened to align with the peaceful hall agenda, providing intellectual cover for what was essentially a public safety measure.
Women's role in this system merits specific attention. The brewster, usually a woman, held primary responsibility for implementing the seasonal variations. She decided exactly how much malt went into each batch, exactly when fermentation stopped, exactly which barrels went where. Her judgment determined whether the household's ale fell on the strong or weak side of acceptable. In a society that granted women few formal positions of authority, the brewster wielded real power over the mood and safety of the entire community.
The lady of the manor occupied a parallel role in maintaining household peace through methods less quantifiable than beer strength. Her job during winter months included managing the emotional temperature of the confined population. She arranged for entertainment, mediated disputes, provided counsel to the troubled, and generally served as a stabilizing presence when tensions rose. The partnership between lord and lady in managing winter peace appears constantly in contemporary literature, with successful ladies praised for their ability to maintain harmony and unsuccessful ones blamed for allowing discord to flourish. Children complicated the equation in ways that medieval household managers clearly understood. Young people experience confinement differently than adults. Their energy, unchanneled, becomes destructive. Their conflicts, unmediated, escalate rapidly. The household that failed to occupy its young people during winter found itself dealing with fights, property damage, and the kind of minor cruelties that poison community atmosphere. The elderly presented different challenges.
Older household members had longer memories and deeper grievances. They remembered slights from decades past and felt entitled to express resentment that younger people might suppress. The respect due to elders in medieval society complicated efforts to manage their behavior. You couldn't simply order grandmother to stop talking about how grandfather cheated her family during that land dispute in 1198, but you could arrange for grandmother to sit far from the people she was most likely to antagonize, and you could ensure that her ale cup was filled with the weakest available supply.
The physical toll of winter confinement on mental health shows clearly in medieval medical texts. What we would recognize as depression appears under various humoral diagnoses. Anxiety manifests as disorders of the spirits. The cabin fever that anyone who's lived through a long winter recognizes appears as a specific malady requiring treatment. Medieval physicians prescribed various remedies, most involving dietary adjustment, and many of those adjustments involved reducing alcohol intake during the most psychologically challenging months.
The connection between alcohol and mental health during confinement created a vicious cycle that the quiet rules attempted to break. Depressed people drink more. Drinking more deepens depression. Deeper depression increases irritability and reduces impulse control. Reduced impulse control in a confined space with weapons and grievances produces violence. Violence traumatizes the community and deepens depression. The only intervention point accessible to medieval household managers was the alcohol supply, so that's where they intervened. As the winter of 1167 approached, the household of Count Henry of Champagne faced a particularly difficult situation. The Count's territories had suffered poor harvests for 2 consecutive years. Food stores were depleted. Tempers were already frayed before the first frost. The brewing supplies that normally would have lasted through spring were barely adequate for half that time if the household continued drinking at normal strength. The Count's steward faced an impossible calculation: reduce rations immediately and face chronic resentment, or maintain normal supply and run out completely by midwinter. The solution he devised became legendary in household management circles for the next century. Rather than implementing immediate reduction, the steward created an elaborate system of graduated decrease. Each week the beer grew slightly weaker. The change was subtle enough that no single day felt significantly different from the one before. By midwinter, the household was consuming ale at half its normal strength, but nobody had experienced a sudden shock of deprivation. The steward had essentially boiled the frog slowly, reducing intoxication without triggering the rebellion that sudden reduction would have caused.
The winter passed without major incident. When spring arrived and stronger ale became available again, the household celebrated with genuine joy rather than the desperate relief that characterized emergence from typical medieval winters. The Count rewarded his steward handsomely, and the story spread. Graduated reduction became a standard technique, one of many tools in the arsenal of those responsible for keeping people alive through the dark months.
But even the best systems fail under extreme stress. The winter of 1316 tested every quiet rule across Europe simultaneously. A volcanic eruption in the Pacific had disrupted weather patterns worldwide. Crops failed catastrophically. The Great Famine began. And into this disaster walked the usual requirements of winter confinement, intensified beyond anything previous generations had experienced.
The chronicles from that terrible winter read like horror fiction. Households that had maintained peace for generations exploded into violence.
The weak beer that normally kept tempers manageable couldn't compensate for actual starvation. Grain that should have gone into brewing went into bread, leaving nothing for ale at all in many communities. Withdrawal symptoms compounded the psychological stress of hunger. People who had drunk ale daily their entire lives suddenly found themselves without access to any alcohol at all, while simultaneously confined and starving.
The death toll from violence during that winter exceeded even the death toll from starvation in some regions. Communities that had developed elaborate systems for managing conflict discovered that those systems required a minimum baseline of resources to function. Below that baseline, nothing worked. The quiet rules were predicated on the ability to provide some ale, even weak ale, to maintain minimal peace. When that provision became impossible, the entire framework collapsed. The lessons from 1316 shaped household management for the next 2 centuries. Reserve supplies became more carefully guarded. Contingency plans for famine scenarios entered the standard steward's training. The connection between alcohol provision and community survival became explicit in ways it had previously remained implicit. Lords who had viewed beer as a luxury began treating it as essential infrastructure, no different from walls or weapons in its importance to survival.
The system evolved and adapted, but never disappeared. Even as the medieval period gave way to early modern times, even as heating technology improved and winter confinement became less absolute, the principles underlying the quiet rules continued to shape how communities thought about alcohol and conflict. The automatic connection between strong drink and violent potential became embedded in European culture deeply enough that it persists to this day, even among people who've never heard of small ale or winter brewing schedules.
And now we reach the turning point of our story, because what I've described so far is the system that developed to manage a specific problem in a specific context. Strong beer plus confinement plus grievances equals violence. Weak beer reduces one variable in that equation, but the equation itself reveals something deeper about human nature that the medieval household managers understood and that we've largely forgotten.
The beer wasn't the cause. The beer was a catalyst. The real causes were the conditions that made people want to hurt each other. Competition for scarce resources, status anxiety, accumulated grievances, lack of privacy, absence of escape. Weakening the beer didn't solve any of those underlying problems. It just prevented them from igniting. The system was palliative, not curative. It kept people alive through winter without addressing why they wanted each other dead.
In Part 2, we're going to explore what happened when some communities tried to address those underlying causes. We'll see experiments in medieval social engineering that sound startlingly modern, attempts to restructure households and communities to reduce conflict at its source, rather than simply suppressing its expression. We'll visit places where the quiet rules evolved into something more ambitious and more disturbing, and we'll discover why most of those experiments failed, leaving us with the system of managed suppression that characterized medieval winter life.
The frost isn't just coming, the frost is here, and the hall is full of people who have nowhere else to go.
The monastery of Villers-la-Ville sits in ruins now, crumbling walls and empty arches in the Belgian countryside. But in 1212, it was the site of one of the most ambitious social experiments in medieval history. The abbot, a man named William, whose surviving writings reveal a mind that would have been comfortable in a modern sociology department, decided that weakening the beer wasn't enough. He wanted to eliminate the conditions that made people want to fight in the first place.
William's analysis of winter violence ran deeper than his contemporaries. He observed that the conflicts erupting in confined communities followed predictable patterns. They clustered around resource competition, status anxiety, and accumulated grievances. The beer simply determined whether those tensions found violent expression or remained contained. Remove the beer variable entirely, and the tensions would find other outlets. Reduce the beer, and you bought time but solved nothing. The only real solution, William concluded, was restructuring the community itself to eliminate the conditions that generated conflict. His first innovation involved eliminating private property within the monastery entirely. This wasn't unusual for monastic communities in theory, but most monasteries allowed monks to maintain personal items, clothing, tools, small treasures brought from their previous lives. William abolished all of it. Every item in the monastery belonged to the community. Every tool was issued from a central storehouse and returned after use. Every piece of clothing was identical, rotated through the population so that no one wore the same garment twice in a row. The goal was to eliminate any basis for material jealousy. The second innovation addressed status anxiety. William abolished all distinctions of rank within the daily operations of the monastery. The abbot himself took turns scrubbing floors. The newest novice might find himself leading prayers. Work assignments rotated randomly, preventing anyone from developing a sense of ownership over particular tasks. The hierarchies that normally structured monastic life, hierarchies that bred resentment when men of ability found themselves subordinate to men of seniority, simply disappeared.
The third innovation was the most radical. William established a formalized grievance system that required conflicts to be surfaced immediately rather than allowed to fester. Twice daily, the community gathered for what William called the clearing, a structured session where anyone who felt wronged could voice their complaint directly. The person accused would respond. The community would witness. Resolution was expected before the session ended. Grievances that went unvoiced beyond 24 hours were considered forfeit. The accumulation that normally poisoned relationships was mechanically prevented.
The results were remarkable for exactly one winter. Villers-la-Ville in 1212-1213 experienced something approaching genuine peace. The chronicles record an atmosphere of calm that visitors found almost unsettling. Men who had previously simmered with resentment seemed genuinely content. The weak winter ale became almost unnecessary because the conditions that made strong ale dangerous had been largely eliminated. William believed he had solved the fundamental problem of human coexistence.
Then came the second winter. The system that had worked perfectly with a population of believers began to strain as new members arrived who hadn't internalized the philosophy. The clearing sessions, which had functioned as genuine conflict resolution, became weaponized. Men learned to deploy accusations strategically, using the grievance system to attack rivals rather than resolve genuine disputes. The elimination of private property, which had seemed liberating, revealed itself as a source of constant friction as men disagreed about who should use which tools when. The rotation of roles created its own resentments when incompetent men were placed in positions that required skill.
By the third winter, Villers-la-Ville had become more violent than a conventional monastery. The experiment, designed to eliminate conflict, had instead concentrated and intensified it. William's system required everyone to participate sincerely, and the moment that sincerity faltered, the entire structure became a machine for generating grievances rather than resolving them. The monastery returned to traditional practices, including the quiet rules about winter beer. William spent his remaining years trying to understand what had gone wrong.
If you felt something click into place just now, that recognition that systems designed to create perfect harmony often produce perfect discord,
That's exactly why I spend my nights researching these stories. The subscribe button is there if you want more moments like this one.
The failure at Villers-la-Ville didn't end experimentation. It merely channeled it in different directions. Across Europe, other communities developed their own variations on the basic problem of winter confinement and communal violence. Some focused on architecture, some focused on scheduling, some focused on the composition of the community itself. All of them struggled with the same fundamental tension that William had encountered. Systems that work require participants who believe in them, but belief cannot be mandated, and the moment belief wavers, the system collapses.
The architectural experiments produced some of the strangest medieval buildings that survive. The Priory of Lewes developed a hall design where every seat faced the same direction, preventing the eye contact that often preceded violence. The theory was that men who couldn't see each other's faces couldn't read insults into expressions. The practice proved impractical. You can't eat a meal while staring at the back of someone's head without spilling. You can't converse. You can't function as a community. The design was abandoned within a decade, but the building still stands, its peculiar seating arrangement preserved in the stone placement of its floor.
More successful were the experiments in spatial separation. The Manor of Thornbury in Gloucestershire developed a system where the Great Hall was divided into cells by movable screens. Each cell could accommodate 4 to 6 people. Families and compatible groups were assigned to cells that could be rearranged depending on which combinations proved volatile. The screens provided visual privacy without physical separation, allowing people to feel a sense of personal space while remaining part of the communal environment. Winter violence at Thornbury dropped substantially once this system was implemented.
The cellular approach spread rapidly once its effectiveness became known. By the 14th century, many noble households had adopted some version of the screened hall. The screens themselves became objects of artistic elaboration, carved and painted with scenes that provided visual distraction for people sitting in close proximity for months at a time. The surviving examples in museums are displayed as art objects, but their original purpose was psychological management. Beauty served function.
Scheduling innovations proved equally important. The Benedictine daily rhythm of prayer at fixed hours wasn't originally designed for conflict management, but monasteries quickly recognized its value for that purpose. Secular households adopted similar approaches, creating structured days that moved people through activities in patterns that limited opportunities for conflict. The principle was simple. People who are busy have less time to brood, and people who are tired have less energy to fight.
The household of Eleanor of Aquitaine developed one of the most sophisticated scheduling systems of the 12th century. Her steward maintained what amounted to a master calendar that tracked not just activities, but relationships. Men who were developing a grudge would find themselves assigned to work details on opposite sides of the castle. Women who were competing for the same man's attention would be scheduled for activities that kept them apart during vulnerable hours. Children who were bullying each other would discover that their playmates had been reshuffled overnight. The schedule was the primary instrument of peace management, more important even than the beer supply.
Eleanor's system required constant information gathering. Her ladies-in-waiting functioned as intelligence operatives, reporting on which relationships were straining, which alliances were forming, which resentments were building. The Queen herself held daily briefings where this information was analysed and scheduling adjustments were made accordingly. Modern human resources departments operate on essentially the same principles, managing workplace relationships through assignment and scheduling decisions. Eleanor would recognise their work immediately.
The most extreme experiments involved controlling the composition of the community itself. Some households adopted policies of deliberate dispersal, sending household members away during winter to reduce the confined population. Younger sons might be sent to serve in other households. Servants whose personalities proved volatile might be reassigned to outlying estates. The calculus was cold but effective. remove the individuals most likely to cause problems, and the problems diminished accordingly.
This dispersal strategy created its own economy. Households that needed winter workers could acquire them from households that needed to reduce their populations. The individuals transferred often had no choice in the matter. They became, in effect, human pressure valves, moved around the system to prevent explosions. The experience of being sent away, of knowing that your presence was considered dangerous enough to require exile, marked people for life. Some internalized the judgment and became model members of their new communities. Others carried the resentment forward, eventually exploding in the violence they'd been sent away to prevent.
The gender dynamics of these transfers deserve attention. Women were moved far more frequently than men, partly because they had fewer rights to resist, and partly because male violence was considered more dangerous and therefore more important to manage in place. A volatile man might be worth keeping if his skills were valuable. A volatile woman was simply removed. The records show young women shuffled between households year after year, never staying long enough to form attachments, always arriving just as winter began and departing as spring allowed travel. Their experience of medieval winter was one of constant displacement.
Children occupied a peculiar position in these calculations. Young children were generally kept with their mothers, regardless of other considerations. But children approaching adolescence, especially boys, were increasingly viewed as potential sources of violence. The practice of fostering out, sending boys to be raised in other households, served multiple purposes. It created political alliances between families, it provided training opportunities, and it reduced the number of volatile young males competing for status within any single household. The custom that seems merely traditional when described in textbooks was, in its practical application, a form of demographic violence prevention.
The Church contributed its own demographic intervention through the practice of oblation, offering children to monasteries. Parents who recognized violent tendencies in their children, or who simply wanted to reduce the number of competing heirs, could give those children to the Church. The child's consent wasn't required. The family gained merit for their piety while simultaneously removing a potential problem. The monasteries gained labor and future monks. Everyone benefited except the children themselves, who might spend their entire lives in communities they'd never chosen, governed by rules designed partly to contain the violence that their presence might otherwise have caused.
The scale of this demographic management becomes clearer when you examine the records systematically. A household of 100 people at the start of autumn might shrink to 60 by midwinter, as various members were dispersed, fostered out, or assigned to distant properties. The reduction happened gradually, through individual decisions that seemed unrelated but followed a clear pattern. The household steward orchestrating these movements was essentially curating a population optimized for peaceful coexistence during the dangerous months.
Economic constraints limited these options for smaller households. A peasant family couldn't send its volatile members elsewhere because there was nowhere for them to go. The quiet rules in village communities relied more heavily on beer management and less on population manipulation. This created a stratified system, where the wealthy could buy their way out of winter violence through dispersal, while the poor remained trapped together, dependent entirely on the weak ale and the vigilance of their neighbours.
The development of ale houses in medieval villages partly addressed this disparity. An ale house provided a space outside the home where tensions could be redirected. Men who were reaching the breaking point within their family dwelling could walk to the alehouse and fight with strangers instead of relatives. This wasn't a solution so much as a displacement of the problem. Violence still happened, but it happened between people who would separate at the end of the evening, rather than people who would have to face each other every morning for the rest of winter.
The regulation of alehouses during winter months became a significant focus of local governance.
The hours of operation, the strength of the drinks served, the physical layout of the space, all fell under official scrutiny. Some villages required alehouses to close entirely during the darkest months, forcing people back into their homes, where family and community pressure might constrain their behaviour. Other villages took the opposite approach, extending alehouse hours to provide maximum escape valve capacity. The debates about which approach worked better filled manor court records and village council minutes.
Entertainment emerged as another crucial variable in the winter peace equation. The travelling performers who circulated through medieval Europe were far more than simple entertainers. They were psychological infrastructure. Their presence in a hall changed the dynamic entirely. Attention that might otherwise focus on grievances focused instead on the show. Conversations that might otherwise turn to old arguments turned instead to shared reactions to the performance. The investment that households made in winter entertainment, an investment that seems extravagant in the historical record, made perfect sense as expenditure on peace maintenance.
The content of the entertainment mattered. Performances that aroused strong emotions could destabilize rather than stabilize. A tale of betrayal might remind listeners of their own betrayals. A song about lost love might inflame jealousies that had been successfully suppressed. The most sought-after performers were those who could read a room and adjust their material accordingly, providing distraction without provocation. This skill, the ability to entertain without inflammatory content, commanded premium prices during winter seasons.
Religious observance served parallel functions. The church calendar provided a structure of feast days and fast days that punctuated winter monotony. The requirement to attend services multiple times weekly created guaranteed departures from the household environment. The content of the services focused on themes of forgiveness, patience, and the temporary nature of earthly suffering, reinforced the psychological management agenda. Medieval preachers knew exactly what they were doing when they emphasized these themes during winter months.
The confessional became a particularly powerful tool. The requirement to confess sins before receiving communion meant that violent impulses had to be disclosed to someone who might intervene. Priests who heard confessions of hatred and violent intent faced a decision about whether to maintain confidentiality or to warn potential victims. The formal rules of confession required secrecy, but informal networks often ensured that dangerous information reached the people who needed it. The steward who received a quiet warning from the parish priest about simmering conflicts within his household could adjust his management accordingly.
Sexual politics complicated everything. Winter confinement intensified romantic and sexual relationships, both legitimate and otherwise. Affairs that could be conducted discreetly during summer when people were dispersed across fields and forests became nearly impossible to hide when everyone lived in a single building. The discovery of adultery, or even the suspicion of adultery, could trigger exactly the kind of violence that all the quiet rules were designed to prevent.
The solution most households adopted involved a combination of physical barriers and social surveillance. Sleeping arrangements were structured to prevent privacy between people who weren't married to each other. The movement of individuals after dark was tracked and restricted. Women's quarters were separated from men's quarters with guarded passages between them. The goal wasn't to prevent all sexual contact, but to prevent the specific kinds of sexual contact most likely to trigger violent responses from the parties affected. These arrangements created their own frictions. Young couples seeking legitimate intimacy found themselves as constrained as would-be adulterers. The surveillance necessary to catch forbidden relationships also caught innocent ones. Privacy became a luxury that winter denied to everyone, and the lack of privacy bred resentment that the system was supposed to prevent.
Medieval household managers were essentially trying to solve an optimization problem with no perfect solution, trading one type of conflict for another while hoping the trades improved the overall situation. The role of animals in winter household dynamics receives surprisingly little attention in modern historical writing, but medieval sources treat it extensively. Bringing livestock into shared living spaces during cold months added entirely new sources of conflict. Disputes over whose animal occupied which space, complaints about noise and smell, arguments about feeding schedules and waste disposal, all generated friction that could escalate unpredictably. The quiet rules for animals paralleled the quiet rules for humans, with designated locations, controlled movements, and severe penalties for violations.
Dogs presented particular problems. The hunting dogs that noble households maintained were bred for aggression. Confining them in close quarters with people who were themselves on edge created multiple opportunities for disaster. The solution most households adopted involved maintaining the dogs in separate kennels, heated by their own fires, attended by designated keepers who rarely interacted with the main household. The expense was considerable, but the alternative was regular incidents of dogs fighting, dogs biting, and the human violence that followed when beloved animals were injured. Horses required their own protocols. A noble household might maintain dozens of horses over winter, each representing enormous economic value, and each requiring daily attention. Competition for the best horses, disputes over exercise schedules, arguments about feed allocation, these generated conflicts that had to be managed alongside the human conflicts. The stable became a separate jurisdiction with its own steward, its own rules, its own system of weak ale for the grooms who tended the animals through the long, dark months. The health dimension of winter confinement added another layer of complexity. People got sick. Close quarters accelerated disease transmission. The physically miserable are more irritable, more likely to snap at provocations they might otherwise ignore. Illness also disrupted the carefully constructed schedules and spatial arrangements that maintained peace. A sick person couldn't be moved to reduce tension because movement might worsen their condition. The conflict between health management and peace management created impossible choices that stewards faced every winter. Death during winter posed its own challenges. A death in the household disrupted everything. Grief destabilized emotional equilibrium. Inheritance disputes surfaced immediately because they couldn't be postponed until the weather allowed lawyers to travel. The body itself presented practical problems during frozen months when burial was difficult or impossible. Some households stored corpses in cold outbuildings until spring thaw permitted proper interment. Others conducted winter burials that required enormous labor to dig through frozen ground. Either approach generated new conflicts that added to the burden the quiet rules were struggling to manage. The mental toll of watching people die in close quarters, of smelling the sick, of knowing that your own turn might come, of grieving without the release that action provides, this accumulated through winter in ways that weak ale could only partially address. Medieval sources describe something resembling collective depression settling over households as winter deepened. The chroniclers call it winter sorrow or the dark heaviness. Modern psychology would recognize it as seasonal affective disorder, complicated by grief and confinement stress. The quiet rules existed in this context of pervasive psychological suffering that no amount of brewing adjustment could cure. Some households experimented with light management as a supplement to alcohol management. The wealthy installed more windows than structural necessity required, accepting the heat loss in exchange for the mood benefit of natural illumination. Mirrors and polished metal were positioned to reflect and multiply available light. Candle allocations increased during the darkest months, even though candles were expensive,
because the alternative was people sitting in darkness, developing the thoughts that darkness breeds. Light was understood as having psychological value, separate from its practical utility.
Colour played a similar role. The medieval hall during winter was deliberately decorated with bright fabrics and painted surfaces that provided visual stimulation in an environment that otherwise offered only grey stone and brown wood. The tapestries that survive in museums weren't just displays of wealth, they were psychological interventions, providing colour and imagery and narrative during months when the world outside offered nothing but white and grey. The fact that these tapestries often depicted violent scenes, hunts and battles and mythological conflicts, might seem counterproductive, but the theory was that vicarious violence reduced actual violence. Watching depicted combat satisfied impulses that might otherwise find real expression.
Games served multiple purposes in the winter peace infrastructure. Board games provided mental occupation that competitive personalities could channel away from interpersonal conflict. Physical games allowed aggressive impulses to find acceptable outlets. The elaborate tournament culture of medieval nobility partly originated as a winter activity, a structured competition that let young men fight each other under controlled conditions, rather than fighting over women and status in uncontrolled conditions. The injuries that resulted were considered acceptable losses compared to the deaths that might otherwise occur.
Gambling added a dangerous variable to the game equation. Games of chance involving money or goods generated their own conflicts. A man who lost substantially at dice might develop the kind of resentment that the quiet rules were designed to prevent. The solution most households adopted involved allowing gambling but limiting stakes and requiring that debts be settled immediately rather than carried forward. A gambling debt that lingered became a source of tension. A gambling debt settled on the spot remained a matter of entertainment.
The regulation of gambling stakes during winter became elaborate. Some households prohibited gambling entirely during the confined months. Others allowed it only on designated days. The Church weighed in with its own prohibitions and permissions, adding religious penalties to the secular consequences for violations. The overall effect was to create a complex web of rules governing exactly when, how much, and with whom one could gamble, rules that generated their own conflicts through their complexity and their enforcement.
Work allocation emerged as perhaps the most contentious arena of winter household management. With outdoor labour impossible for much of the season, people competed for the indoor tasks that conferred status or comfort. The man assigned to tend the fire held a better position than the man assigned to empty chamber pots. The woman given spinning in the warm hall lived better than the woman given laundry in the cold outbuilding. These assignments were gifts in the power of the steward, and the distribution of gifts generated resentments that had to be managed alongside all the other resentments.
The fairness problem haunted every steward. Rotate assignments to prevent jealousy, and you give unpleasant work to people who had done nothing to deserve it. Assign based on merit, and you create a hierarchy that breeds resentment in those at the bottom. Assign based on seniority, and you frustrate the talented young. Assign based on need, and you create incentives for people to exaggerate their needs. No solution was perfect. The best stewards developed systems that seemed fair enough to prevent rebellion, while maintaining enough flexibility to respond to changing circumstances. This itself was a full-time job during winter months. Food allocation presented similar challenges, with higher stakes. The medieval winter diet was monotonous and often insufficient. Preserved meats, dried fish, stored grains, root vegetables that had been in cellars for months. This was the fare that people ate day after day, while watching their betters consume fresh provisions from reserved stocks. The inequality was visible at every meal, with the Lord's table receiving different food than the lower tables. This visibility could be managed through various strategies, but never eliminated entirely.
The hunger of the confined poor shared space with the relative plenty of the confined wealthy, and this proximity generated a specific kind of resentment that no amount of weak ale could fully suppress.
The most volatile moments often involve transitions. The arrival of a new person disrupted established equilibrium. The departure of someone left holes in the social fabric that others rushed to fill, sometimes violently. The beginning of a fast period, the end of a fast period, the first signs of spring, the final storms of late winter. These transitions destabilized communities that had achieved fragile balance. The quiet rules evolved to include specific protocols for managing transitions, additional vigilance during vulnerable periods, sometimes stronger beer to mark celebrations, and sometimes weaker beer to dampen the excitement that celebrations could generate.
The approach of spring brought its own dangers. People could feel the end of confinement coming. Patience that had held through the long, dark months began to fray as the promise of release approached. The fights that happened in early spring were often more vicious than those of midwinter, because people felt they had endured so much already and shouldn't have to endure any more. The final weeks of confinement required maximum vigilance from household managers who were themselves exhausted from months of constant crisis management.
And then finally the thaw. Doors opened, people dispersed. The pressure that had built through months of confinement dissipated as individuals found space to be alone, to be away, to be anywhere but in that hall with those people. The first days of spring in a medieval community must have felt like the end of a siege. The joy was real, the relief was palpable. The promise that next winter might be different, that the quiet rules might finally work perfectly, that the violence might finally be prevented rather than merely reduced. This hope renewed itself every year with the melting snow. But the memory of what happened during winter didn't dissolve with the ice. The grudges that weak ale had suppressed but not eliminated emerged in spring with renewed force. The insults that had been swallowed in January were remembered in April. The competitions that had been postponed during confinement resumed the moment mobility returned. Spring was festival season, wedding season, market season, but it was also vendetta season. The violence that winter rules had prevented often happened as soon as the rules no longer applied.
This seasonal pattern of suppression and release shaped medieval society in ways we rarely acknowledge. The feuds that seem irrational in historical accounts often make sense when viewed through the lens of winter accumulation and spring explosion. The alliances that seemed to form suddenly were actually brewing all winter in confined halls where people had nothing to do but think. The cultural emphasis on honor and the willingness to kill for insults originated partly in communities where insults couldn't be answered during winter and therefore had to be answered later with interest.
In Part 3, we'll explore where this all led. We'll see how the quiet rules evolved as technology changed, as housing improved, as alcohol became more varied. We'll trace the threads forward to our own time and discover, perhaps uncomfortably, how much of what we think of as human nature is actually human response to circumstances that the modern world has partly eliminated and partly recreated in different forms. The hall is quieter now, but the frost still comes.
The year is 1589, and something has changed. The great hall of a prosperous English manor stands quiet on a February evening, but not because of the quiet rules. The hall is quiet because almost nobody is in it. The lord and his family occupy private chambers with their own fireplaces, technologies that would have seemed impossibly extravagant a century before, but have become standard for anyone above the peasant class. The servants have their own quarters, cramped but separate.
The communal living that defined medieval winter has begun its long dissolution into the private dwelling that we now consider normal.
The chimneys made this possible. The medieval hall required everyone to gather around a central hearth, because that was where the heat was. The smoke rose to a hole in the roof, and the warmth radiated outward in a diminishing circle. Privacy meant cold. The chimney changed everything by allowing fire to be contained in multiple locations throughout a building. Suddenly, a household could have several heated rooms instead of one. The wealthy began dividing their homes into separate spaces, and the confinement that had shaped medieval winter for centuries started to loosen.
The quiet rules didn't disappear immediately. They evolved. The weak winter ale that had prevented violence in communal halls continued to be brewed and served, but its function shifted. Now it was less about preventing murder and more about maintaining household economy. Strong beer cost more than weak beer. Serving weak beer during winter was simply good household management. The connection to violence prevention faded from cultural memory, even as the practice itself continued under different justification.
The steward's role transformed as well. The psychological management that had been his primary winter responsibility became less critical as people gained the ability to avoid each other. The elaborate intelligence networks, the careful scheduling, the constant vigilance for developing conflicts, these became less necessary when conflicts could be diffused simply by sending people to different rooms. The steward of 1600 managed logistics more than psychology. His predecessor of 1400 would barely have recognized the job. Glass windows amplified the transformation. The medieval hall had small windows, minimal light, a darkness that bred dark thoughts. By the 17th century, glass had become affordable enough that middling households could install windows that admitted genuine illumination. The psychological benefit of light, which medieval wealthy had accessed through expensive architectural choices, became available to a broader population. The winter darkness that had contributed to depression and conflict partially lifted. But the fundamental problem didn't vanish. It transformed. People who no longer lived in communal halls still lived in families. Families still experienced conflict. Winter still confined people together more than summer did. The violence that had erupted in great halls found new venues in private homes. The shift was from spectacular to domestic, from visible to hidden, from community concern to family secret. The quiet rules that had governed public spaces gave way to the unwritten rules that governed private ones. The introduction of distilled spirits complicated everything. Medieval communities had dealt with ale and wine, drinks that took time to produce intoxication, and more time still to reach the dangerous levels where violence became likely. Gin, whiskey, and other spirits delivered alcohol in concentrated form that could transform a peaceful evening into a violent disaster within an hour. The quiet rules that had calibrated to slow-acting beer proved inadequate for fast-acting spirits. The gin crisis of 18th century London demonstrates what happens when a new intoxicant meets an old problem without appropriate adaptation. The urban poor of London lived in conditions that replicated medieval confinement, but without the medieval management structures. Whole families occupied single rooms. Multiple families shared buildings. Privacy didn't exist. And into this situation arrived cheap gin that could render someone dangerously drunk in minutes rather than hours. The resulting chaos horrified observers who had forgotten how their ancestors had lived.
The response involved reinventing the quiet rules for a new context. Gin taxes made the spirit more expensive and therefore less accessible to those who couldn't afford to get safely drunk at home. Licensing laws restricted where and when spirits could be sold. Public drunkenness became subject to legal penalty rather than merely social disapproval.
The state took over functions that medieval households and communities had managed privately. The same logic that had led stewards to serve weak ale led legislators to restrict spirit sales.
The temperance movements of the 19th century represented the most extreme extension of quiet rule logic. If weak beer prevented some violence, surely no beer would prevent even more. The utopian vision of a society free from alcohol entirely motivated reformers who saw themselves as completing what their medieval ancestors had started. They weren't entirely wrong about the connection between alcohol and violence. They were wrong about the possibility of eliminating alcohol, and wrong about what would replace it. Prohibition in America demonstrated the limits of legislative solutions to chemical, psychological problems. Remove legal alcohol and illegal alcohol appears. Illegal alcohol carries additional dangers beyond intoxication: criminal suppliers, contaminated products, absence of regulatory oversight. The violence that prohibition was supposed to prevent was replaced by violence of organized crime and enforcement. The medieval steward serving weak ale had understood something that 20th century legislators forgot. You can't eliminate the desire for intoxication. You can only manage it. The industrial workplace became a new arena for quiet rule thinking. Factories concentrated people in close proximity under stressful conditions for extended hours. The dynamics that had characterized medieval great halls reappeared in mill towns and manufacturing districts. Employers discovered independently what medieval stewards had known. People in forced proximity need management to prevent conflict. The structured days, the controlled movements, the prohibition of alcohol during working hours, these weren't simply about productivity. They were about preventing the violence that concentration breeds.
Modern workplace human resources departments descend directly from this lineage. The careful attention to interpersonal conflicts, the scheduling of activities to prevent problematic combinations, the monitoring of moods and relationships, all of this replicates what medieval stewards did during winter confinement. The vocabulary has changed, the setting has changed. The fundamental problem of managing humans in close quarters remains exactly what it was 8 centuries ago.
The architecture of modern offices reveals the same concerns that shaped medieval halls. Open-plan offices claim to encourage collaboration, but actually function as surveillance systems where everyone can see everyone else. Private offices provide escape valves for high-tension situations. Meeting rooms create neutral spaces for potentially difficult conversations. The physical layout of a contemporary workplace serves psychological management purposes that its occupants rarely consciously recognize, but that a medieval steward would understand immediately. Schools operate on similar principles. The scheduling of activities, the assignment of students to classrooms, the rules governing movement and speech, all address the basic problem of confining young people together without producing violence. The school administrator who separates 2 students who've been fighting uses exactly the spatial management strategy that medieval stewards employed. The school psychologist who monitors social dynamics and intervenes before conflicts escalate does the work that household ladies once performed. Prisons represent the most extreme contemporary version of medieval winter confinement. People who cannot leave, concentrated in limited space, watched constantly, their every moment structured and scheduled. The violence that erupts in prisons follows patterns that medieval chroniclers would recognize. The management strategies that correctional institutions employ descend directly from the quiet rules that governed households centuries ago. Prison administrators read research studies and implement evidence-based practices, but the evidence keeps pointing back to principles that illiterate stewards discovered through trial and error.
Military barracks face the same challenges and employ the same solutions.
Young men with aggressive tendencies confined together for extended periods require elaborate management to prevent them from destroying each other before they can be deployed against enemies. The structured days, the hierarchical discipline, the controlled access to alcohol, the carefully organized recreation, military tradition carries forward practices developed for the same purposes in very different contexts.
The household itself remains the primary site of winter confinement for most people, even in an age of central heating and private rooms. Families still spend more time together in winter than summer. Conflicts still escalate during dark months. Domestic violence statistics spike during holiday seasons when families gather and during winter storms that trap people together. The modern home may have multiple rooms and adequate heating, but the psychology of confinement operates regardless of physical comfort.
The COVID-19 lockdowns of 2020 and 2021 provided the most dramatic modern demonstration of quiet rule relevance. Suddenly, entire populations experienced something resembling medieval winter confinement. People who had never been trapped with their families discovered what it meant to have no escape. The domestic violence reports that flooded hotlines worldwide confirmed what medieval stewards had known. The substance abuse statistics that climbed throughout the lockdowns confirmed it again. The mental health crisis that emerged from extended confinement confirmed it a third time.
The interesting observation from the lockdown experience is how little the management strategies had evolved. Authorities urged people to maintain schedules, to exercise, to limit alcohol consumption, to find activities that occupied time and attention. These recommendations repeated almost exactly what medieval household guides advised. The technology had changed beyond recognition. The human psychology remained unchanged. The solutions that worked in 1350 worked in 2020, because the problem they addressed was the same problem.
But there was one crucial difference. Medieval communities expected confinement. They prepared for it. They developed elaborate systems for managing it. Modern communities did not expect confinement and had lost the cultural knowledge of how to manage it. The quiet rules that had been common knowledge in 1400 had been forgotten by 2020. People trapped together had to rediscover independently what their ancestors had known collectively.
Climate change threatens to restore the relevance of this forgotten knowledge. Extreme weather events increasingly trap communities together for extended periods. Power outages during winter storms eliminate the heating and lighting that made private dwelling possible. The future may require skills that the past discarded, skills for living together in close quarters without killing each other.
Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. If this story changed how you think about the relationship between alcohol, architecture, and human violence, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe and share your thoughts. What surprised you most? What connections did you see to your own experience of confinement? What rules has your family developed for getting through difficult times together? I read every comment, and the discussions that develop often teach me things I wouldn't have discovered otherwise.
The story we've traced through these hours circles back to where it began. A medieval lord watering down his beer isn't exercising charity or practicing economy. He's making a calculated decision about human nature. He knows what his household members are capable of when inhibition dissolves and escape is impossible. He knows that the veneer of civilization is thinner than people want to believe. The weak ale is an acknowledgement of human frailty, an admission that the people drinking it cannot be trusted with their full capacities.
This isn't flattering. We prefer to think of ourselves as rational creatures who could handle any situation if only we chose to.
The quiet rules tell a different story. They tell us that our ancestors understood themselves better than we understand ourselves. They knew they needed constraints. They knew that freedom in conditions of confinement produces catastrophe. They built elaborate systems to protect themselves from themselves, and those systems work well enough that we survive to forget we ever needed them.
The modern equivalent of weak winter ale takes many forms. It's the medication that takes the edge off anxiety. It's the therapy that provides an outlet for accumulated rage. It's the vacation that provides escape from situations that have become intolerable. It's the divorce that separates people before they destroy each other. We've medicalized and individualized what was once managed communally, turning shared problems into personal pathologies.
This individualization obscures the structural nature of the problem. Confinement causes conflict regardless of the individuals confined. Concentration breeds violence regardless of the personalities concentrated. The quiet rules recognized this structural reality and addressed it structurally. Modern approaches tend to treat confinement-related conflict as individual dysfunction rather than predictable response to circumstances. We send people to therapy when perhaps we should be adjusting their beer.
The humor in that last sentence shouldn't obscure its serious point. We've developed sophisticated psychological interventions that help individuals cope with circumstances we could alternatively change. We train people to tolerate confinement rather than restructuring the confinement. We medicate the symptoms rather than treating the condition. The medieval approach, for all its limitations, at least recognized that the environment itself was the problem.
The balance between individual adaptation and environmental modification represents perhaps the central question of how to live together. Every society answers it differently. Medieval society tilted heavily toward environmental modification. Modern society tilts toward individual adaptation. Neither approach is complete. Both approaches have costs. The wisdom lies in recognizing that both are needed and calibrating the balance to circumstances. The practical application of this history involves neither romanticizing the past nor dismissing it. Medieval households were oppressive places where individual rights mattered little and collective survival justified extreme impositions. We shouldn't want to return to that. But medieval households had accumulated wisdom about human nature in confinement that we've largely lost. We should want to recover that wisdom and apply it in contexts consistent with modern values. Those equivalents might include architectural choices that provide escape routes and privacy within shared spaces. They might include scheduling practices that limit the duration of forced proximity. They might include substance policies that acknowledge the relationship between intoxicants and conflict. They might include entertainment investments that occupy attention and redirect competitive impulses. They might include conflict resolution mechanisms that surface grievances before they fester. Space exploration offers perhaps the most extreme contemporary application of quiet rule thinking. Astronauts confined in tiny vessels for months at a time face exactly the psychological challenges that medieval households faced during winter. NASA and other space agencies have developed elaborate protocols for managing crew relationships, protocols that reinvent much of what medieval stewards knew. The selection of compatible personalities, the structured activities, the controlled access to communication with the outside world, all of this addresses the ancient problem.
The planned Mars missions will extend these challenges dramatically. Years of confinement with no possibility of evacuation will test human psychology in ways that even medieval households never experienced. The selection and training of Mars crews draws on research that ultimately traces back to the same questions medieval lords asked. How do you keep confined people from destroying each other? What rules and structures prevent violence? The answers will determine whether interplanetary colonization succeeds.
Back on Earth, the increasing density of urban populations creates its own pressures. Cities concentrate people in ways that rural areas never did. The apartment building is a vertical village where strangers share walls and ceilings and floors. The conflicts that arise from this concentration are the modern equivalents of Great Hall tensions. Urban planning that ignores this psychology produces neighborhoods that simmer with resentment and occasionally explode into violence.
Online spaces represent a new frontier for these ancient challenges. Social media platforms concentrate people in digital halls where they can't escape each other. The dynamics that emerge parallel medieval Great Hall dynamics with uncanny precision. Grievances accumulate, factions form, conflicts escalate. The platform operators, whether they realize it or not, play the role of medieval stewards, making decisions about content and access that shape the psychological environment.
The comparison isn't perfect. Digital spaces differ from physical ones in important ways. Exit is possible in ways it wasn't in medieval halls. Physical violence can't occur across the internet, but the psychological patterns translate surprisingly well. The social media platform struggling with toxic communities faces the same fundamental problem that the medieval lord faced with his confined household. Human nature in close quarters generates conflict. Management is necessary.
The frost is always coming somewhere. Confinement recurs in different forms across history. The hall fills again with people who need to survive together until the weather changes. The quiet rules that emerge to manage this eternal situation carry wisdom that transcends their specific historical context. We ignore them at our peril. We study them because understanding the past helps us navigate the present and prepare for the future.
The beer in your glass tonight, whatever its strength, connects you to everyone who ever drank to warm themselves against the cold. The walls around you, however comfortable, connect you to everyone who ever sheltered from weather they couldn't control. The people you live with, whoever they are, connect you to all the people who have tried to survive together without destroying each other. We are links in a very long chain.
The medieval lord who watered his beer was making a choice. He chose collective survival over individual satisfaction. He chose prevention over punishment. He chose structure over freedom. Those choices had costs. His household members resented the thin ale. They complained and grumbled and probably circumvented the rules when they could. But they survived. They came through winter and saw spring. They got to make new choices in a new season. We are still making those choices. Every household, every workplace, every community, every society decides how to balance freedom and constraint, how much individual desire to sacrifice for collective peace, how much management to impose on human nature. The answers change, the question persists. The frost comes every year, and every year the hall fills with people who need to get through it together.
History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. The weak beer of 1200 rhymes with the content moderation of 2020. The steward's scheduling rhymes with the human resources algorithm. The Lord's surveillance rhymes with the security camera. The quiet rules rhyme with every policy ever designed to keep humans from doing what humans do when they're trapped together. We are still writing verses in a very old poem.
The poem isn't finished. The frost will come again, in forms we can anticipate and forms we can't. The hall will fill with people who have nowhere else to go. The beer will flow, weak or strong, and human nature will do what it always does. The only question is whether we remember what our ancestors learned or have to discover it all over again, paying the price in blood that they already paid.
Here's to the stewards who served weak ale and kept their people alive. Here's to everyone who managed the quiet rules and prevented the violence that would have happened without them. Here's to the wisdom they accumulated through centuries of trial and error, wisdom that deserves to be remembered even when the specific circumstances that generated it have passed. They learned something true about us. We should learn it too.
The hall is quieter now. The fire burns low. The frost outside crystallizes on the windows. Whatever you're drinking tonight, raise it to the memory of everyone who got through the dark season before you. They made you possible. Their choices shaped yours. Their survival is your inheritance.
And when your own frost comes, remember what they knew. Weaken what needs weakening. Structure what needs structuring. Watch for the conflicts before they explode. Take care of each other even when you can't stand each other. Get through. Survive. See spring.
Because the frost always ends, the hall always empties, the strong beer comes back in season, and the people who kept the quiet rules get to decide whether to do it all again when the next winter comes. That's the deal. That's always been the deal. Quiet rules in frost for chaos in thaw. Constraints now for freedom later. Weak beer tonight, so there's beer at all tomorrow.
Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for thinking about things that most people never consider. I'll see you in the next one, wherever history takes us, whatever frost we face together.